I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of Astral Affairs Rambova, and I want to read my book to you. The story. Chapter 7. Destination Mystère in Cotedazur. The train station is Juanlespin, France, summer 1926. Richard Hudnut's chauffeur is dozing when he hears the whistle of the train bleu arriving from the Gare de Lyon in Paris. He reaches for his cap on the dashboard, exits the great vehicle, and strides along the concrete walkway alongside the railroad tracks. The train screeches to its halt, steam billowing. As the passengers begin to disembark, he cranes his neck to see Natasha. With limited room in the limousine, he anticipates driving the 5 minutes from the station up to the chateau several times. When the chauffeur sees Natasha, Muzzy, Aunt Teresa, and George appearing with 5 puppies straining on the end of their leashes, and a squealing monkey, he can only grumble through his formal nods while situating his passengers. The limousine lumbers on its way and heads into a turn up the hill onto the Rue Chemin de Crouton, a street lined with towering palms. George sits silently in the back seat, absorbing the vibrational energy of the new terrain. He senses a calm enhanced by the sea air, and even his monkey seems unusually tranquilized. The rarefied locale with its pink and white stuccoed homes is nestled in shrubbery and blooming bougainvillea, providing a privacy only the greatest wealth can afford. Within a few minutes, the chateau's iron gate swings into its slow open. The limousine's approach provides the drama for George, as this is his first view of the chateau. The 24-room manse and unarguably the most impressive residence in Juanlespin. The pups make the first and fast entrance, skittering across the polished marble floor of the chateau's foyer. Richard Hudnut steps forward to shake George's hand, giving a laugh at the monkey perched on his shoulder. George's first impression of Richard Hudnut, or Uncle Dickie, is that of reserved gentleman, yet psychically skeptical. George absorbs his initial impressions and the spiritual emanations from the auspicious home. The Baroque antiques, tapestries with long histories from the early 17th century, and gilded Louis XV and XVI furniture. These treasures for him are still alive with memories of decades gone by. He senses a satisfying affinity with the Riviera, the chateau, and its summer inhabitants. Quote, "The Hudnut Chateau is filled with treasures, old Gobelin tapestries, collections of jade and ambers, and lovely old furniture upholstered in St. Cyr needlepoint in mellowed colors. There are enormous Savonnerie rugs of great beauty and color and design. All of these things, hallowed by the breath of time, give forth a vibrational quality that makes for an unusually psychic atmosphere." End quote. Muzzy whisked George into a tour of the chateau interiors, swanning through the library with its Louis XV armchairs upholstered in pale blue damask. Then it is on to a sitting room with a marble fireplace. In each room the walls are appointed with art, ranging in period and style from modern portraiture to ancient artifact, including works by Rousseau, Filippo Lippi, and Peter Paul Rubens. Muzzy's tour culminates in an exit through the rear of the chateau and the revelation of the Court of Palms. There a fountain gushes a sparkling waterfall, which takes George's breath away. He stands by the cascade to solemnify the moment, facing the panorama of the Mediterranean below. It was with a sense of great purpose he unpacked that evening to settle into his summer residency. As a crimson sun set over the distant haze of the mountains of Esterel, the sitting parlor with adjoining terrace was prepared for its first seance at the chateau. Most of the room's furniture had been removed, all but a round table and positioned chairs. The lights were dimmed, and the heavy draperies drawn, and high on the wall loomed the imposing portrait of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, as executed by the renowned Yugoslavian court painter and Hudnut friend Paul Ivanovich. George took his seat before the sitters, Uncle Dickie, Muzzy, Aunt Teresa, and Natasha, the only sound being a single nightingale warbling its evening song on the terrace. As George began delivering his evening messages from the astral plane, he was already breaking news among the French Riviera's elite. During the summer of 1926, a colony of wealthy Americans populated the prestigious residences along the French Riviera known as the Côte d'Azur. The Mediterranean Sea was not the only force inspiring American royalty to call those hillside estates their homes. The casinos in Monte Carlo, Nice, and Marseille provided an opportunity to parade as high society in their glittering gowns and jewelry. The summer crowd reveled in the aroma of rosemary, lavender, and pine, as well as the balm of their own wealth. This was their ultimate destination. The French Riviera's status-conscious were intrigued to hear news of the handsome, eccentric psychic from New York, and of course those seances being held up at the Hudnut Chateau. They did not comprise a large community of Americans, but their comings and goings were the topics of daily chats in the morning cafes and during their evening promenades. Georgewehner was a new bauble to be fawned over, and his etheric connections on the astral plane rendered him irresistible. When Natasha and Muzzy introduced him to their gold-plated friends, seances were scheduled in villas, castles, and chateaux from Monaco to Antibes. George became a regular guest at the Villa Margaritas in Monaco, the home of Cora Brown Potter of Chicago. Known by her stage name, Mrs. Brown Potter, she was an American who made her name in British theater after separating from her coffee broker tycoon husband. Mrs. Cora Brown mingled with the British royalty, and any invitation to her villa was coveted by the Riviera's rich and famous. George charmed Mrs. Cora Brown and handily won the hearts of many of the American ladies of the Côte d'Azur. He would even convince the modern dancer Loie Fuller of his powers by foretelling a strong-arm robbery on her Paris estate. He dabbled in watercolors and entertained by psychically locating antiques, envisioning the objects d'art, and conveniently including the address of the dealer holding the prize. He also developed a close friendship with Paul Ivanovich. The 67-year-old painter was also engaged at the chateau during the summer of 1926, having been commissioned to paint portraits of Uncle Dickie, Muzzy, Natasha, and George. Throughout June and July, George remained focused on Natasha and took his cues from whatever she seemed preoccupied with each day. His diligence in protecting her from the news about Rudy was sincere, but she nevertheless found copies of Le Figaro left about the chateau by her stepfather. She knew Rudy was in New York, and her attentiveness to this fact made it obvious there could not be enough distance between them for Natasha not to care. Her loved ones at the chateau did their best to prevent Natasha from finding those news items, and maids swept up Uncle Dickie's morning paper if they heard her coming their way. Despite, Natasha felt compelled to know, and if she found a newspaper, she scoured the pages in search of any tidbit. She stayed abreast of Rudy's news as he and Ullman promoted The Son of the Sheik, and as he became the victim of the libelous pink powder puff editorial, attributing effeminacy in American men to his influence. She followed the drama of Rudy's response to the anonymously written editorial, and again she expressed worry to her loved ones, saying perhaps Rudy was smoking too much and drinking questionable whiskey. On Monday, August 16th, her fears realized when a cablegram arrived at the chateau from George Ullman. Muzzy read the cablegram aloud to a wide-eyed Natasha. Rudy was in the Polyclinic Hospital in Manhattan, having fallen ill from complications from a perforated ulcer, and was about to have surgery. Ullman added that Rudy requested the cable be sent to Natasha to express his love and assurances that all would be well. She was not to worry. Natasha's immediate response was to cable her love to Rudy, sharing all best wishes from his loved ones at the chateau. She then retreated with George to seek answers via seance. She placed Rudy's cablegram on the round table in the HPB room and stared at the message from New York, as if in doing so she kept her line to Rudy open and direct. Despite everyone's reassurances of Rudy's robust health and his sure and prompt recovery, Natasha panicked. The cablegram left no doubt about her course of action, and she told George they would return to New York immediately. The arrival of Rudy's next cablegram was anxiously awaited, and Natasha cabled him a second time, sending more love. For a brief while, a glimmer of hope was evident for that overly pondered reunion between Rudy and Natasha. With the cablegram in hand, expressing Rudy's love, Natasha was no longer ambivalent and openly discussed the reconciliation with Rudy. Their divorce, she admitted, had been a mistake. By Wednesday evening, the mood at the chateau was optimistic, with the consensus being that Rudy was healing and his crisis had passed. Surely there would be more encouraging news from Almond in New York in the morning. After dinner and the adjournment to the terrace, Uncle Dickie, Muzzy, Aunt Teresa, Natasha, and George watched a champagne-colored sunset, with Natasha's return to New York for Rudy's recovery lending a joyful tone to their conversation. As the HPB room was being prepared, the medium recalled, quote, "As usual before a seance, I begin to grow extremely sensitive and to feel vibratory emanations from my surroundings. I felt the pressing nearness of another world and the penetrating intermingling of the auras of souls passed on. Then one came nearer who brushed repeatedly against the astral antennae of my nerves and prompted me with an almost overwhelming desire to express his eager messages." End quote. The familiar nightingale warbles on the terrace as Muzzy drapes veils over the sidelights, and the seance sitters take their seats in their familiar circle. Natasha seems irritated. "Never before have I heard a bird sing like that," she says. "I'm going to close the windows. I can't stand it. It makes me think of the Hollywood days with Rudy." With the windows latched shut, Natasha returns to her seat. As Muzzy begins to recite the Lord's Prayer, the mistral winds gust, sending dried palm fronds scraping across the terrace. For George, the atmosphere in the room that Wednesday evening is charged with astral currents, and he witnesses dim, ghostly figures crowding into the room and moving through the ethers. Quote, "As I looked about the circle, I could not help comparing the two kinds of living personalities in the room, the living alive and the living dead. Richard Hudnut, at 70, serenely charming and debonair. Mrs. Hudnut, Muzzy, with her red gold hair and eyes of pale jade. Natasha, calm and stately in emerald and gold lame, her finely chiseled features and dark eyes set off by a turban of vermilion. And then these astral visitors so dim to our perceptions, yet more real and tangibly enduring than any of us on earth." End quote. The nightingale on the terrace can still be heard over the wind, and its persistence feels ominous to George. He sinks into his chair with eyes closed, his breathing growing shallow. In a moment he begins his whistle, but in a strange harmony with the birds' muffled song. His whistling stops, and George sits silently, surrendering his body to the spirits. For a few minutes he speaks rapidly in a garble of voices, children, men, some loud and some murmurs. Natasha defies the decorum and interrupts. "I felt an icy wind blow through the room. Did anyone else notice it?" "I felt it just now, yes," says Muzzy. Uncle Dickie adds, "The room is growing darker." George speaks directly to Natasha in a man's voice, a man with an Italian accent. "Natasha, Natasha," he calls out, "I knew you would come." Natasha startles at the desperate voice. It sounds as if someone is trying to wake from a nightmare. "What? You knew I would come?" "I love you. I knew you would come back," the voice speaks through George. "But I don't understand," Natasha asks. "Come where?" "New York." "But, my dear friend," Muzzy interrupts, "don't be foolish. This is not Manhattan. We are 3,000 miles from there in the south of France." George's head rolls from side to side as the voice seems to drift off, repeating, New York, New York, New York. I have never heard of such a thing, exclaims Muzzy, sounding annoyed. One would think... Hush, mother, says Natasha. This is something unusual. Let him speak to me. George intones. Natasha, where are you? Where are you? Don't go away. Yes, I am Natasha, and I won't go away, but tell me, please, who are you? Rudy, the voice answers. I knew you would come. I knew you would come. Natasha's face grows visibly paler, even in the darkened room. Muzzy eyes her daughter's reaction. Don't you think we should break the circle and bring the medium out of the trance? No, mother, wait. There's something very strange going on here. That voice sounds almost exactly like Rudy's. George's body begins to twitch. He brushes his hand against his face, saying, Natasha, cara mia. The voice then speaks only in Italian. Natasha replies in Italian. After a few minutes, Aunt Teresa asked, What is he saying? What? Natasha answers, He seems to think we are all in New York, and I have come back to him. I can't understand it. It sounds like Rudy, as if he were talking in his sleep. Then a cry from George startles the sitters. Jenny! What does he mean by Jenny? Aunt Teresa asks. Natasha explains. Jenny was June Mathis's mother, Virginia, who helped Rudy when he first came to Hollywood. George then speaks in the voice of a woman, an older woman's voice, repeating the name, Gabriella, Gabriella. Natasha asks, Are you Rudy's mother? The frail voice answers, Si, Gabriella. Gabriella goes on to explain how her son Rudolfo is ill in New York. In her frail voice, she says her son will not recover and will pass on to return to her within a few days. Hearing this, the circle is broken, and George is brought out of his trance. As much as they all want to dismiss the message from Rudy's mother, they all know George capable of prescient knowledge. He is told about the visitations from Rudy and Rudy's mother, Gabriella, with Natasha insisting none of this can possibly be true. Natasha cabled Rudy again on Thursday and Friday morning and was heartened by another cablegram, and this one from him. He expressed his love for her and wrote how he was keeping her first cablegram under his pillow. By Friday, a cablegram arrived from Ullman reporting Rudy much improved and relating news he was expected to leave the hospital within a few days. The chateau is abuzz with the talk of the perfect setting for Rudy's recovery, Natasha's imminent return to New York, and their reunion. Muzzy suggested they retreat to the Hudnut Mountain home in upstate New York, Foxslair, saying the fall foliage in the Catskills and fresh air would be exactly what Rudy needed. Natasha felt Paris or London might provide them with more privacy, and Aunt Teresa suggested they spend the fall in Juanlespin and bring Rudy directly to the chateau. On that Friday, Natasha's love for Rudy turned back time, erasing her past year of misery without him. The mood in the chateau that evening was one of optimism, and they talked of little else but Rudy's recovery and the magnificent reconciliation. The chateau residents gathered for another seance to channel more good news via their medium. Seated once again around the table, Uncle Dickie, Muzzy, Aunt Teresa, and Natasha quieted into the ritual they had come to know well that summer. On that Friday night, there was no bird singing, and despite Natasha's irritation with its persistence, its absence seemed more disturbing. That annoying nightingale, which reminded Natasha of her life in Hollywood with Rudy, was silent. Her heart pounded as she whispered the Lord's Prayer and waited for George to speak. Chapter 8. The Extraordinary Test. The HPB room, the Hudnut Chateau, Juanlespin, Friday evening, August 20th, 1926. Quote, In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, Amen. End quote. Silence then settles over the HPB room as George stops whistling. He begins to speak, and in the measured voice of an elderly man who identifies himself as Rudy's spirit guide, Mesalope, the ancient Egyptian. Natasha startles with the revelation. Mesalope delivers a lengthy message sharing insights into Rudy's psychic achievements on Earth and his spiritual significance. He speaks of Rudy's automatic writing and his deep trance ability, assuring them Rudy was truly an adept master of a high vibrational pattern. Messelope expounds on Rudy's astral importance and how his effect on the world was a gift of great cosmic value. He seems as if he is trying to convince the sitters Rudy was already serving some cause in the great beyond. Quote, Messelope told the eager group, in as gentle manner as possible, that the time of Rudy's stay on Earth was up, that in spite of the reassuring news received from America, Rudy would soon pass from his body. End quote. Uncle Dickie issues a snort of disbelief, and Aunt Teresa and Muzzy watch Natasha sitting with her eyes closed. George then speaks in the voice of a different entity, a louder, stronger voice. He announces he is Rudy's spirit guide, Blackfeather. The American Indian delivers a briefer message, explaining how Rudy's great appeal manifested as the world's recognition of his eternal spirit. Blackfeather says he would soon escort Rudy through his crossing over. The voice fades, saying he could not speak any longer, as it was time for him to return to Rudy's side in New York. Natasha opens her eyes to stare into her lap, stifling sobs as to not jar George from his trance. George recalled the moment. Quote, Then Jenny came through. I have been with Rudy since his illness, she said. I will be with him when the earthly end comes, and how joyfully I will meet him when he begins his life anew. You remember in the previous seance that he called out my name, Jenny? Well, I want you to remember what I am saying. It was at that time they were taking him to the hospital in the ambulance. I was in the ambulance by his side. He opened his eyes and cried out my name. Yes, his time is up. His work is finished, and he will be with us in spirit within the next few days. End quote. The seance ends abruptly with everyone in tears. Natasha stumbles sobbing from the room, with Muzzy bustling alongside. Uncle Dickie makes an effort to reassure Aunt Teresa, saying surely Rudy was young and in good health. He glares at George. Richard, George replies, perhaps this is all wrong. Perhaps the spirits are playing morbid tricks on us, and we will soon hear that Rudy has passed any danger. I am not so sure, George. Uncle Dickie rises from his chair to walk towards the terrace. Messelope and Blackfeather had a great deal to say. Go to Natasha, George. Go. Uncle Dickie then turns to open the great doors and step out into the night. He gazes down at the lights in the harbor, twinkling in the water's reflection. The street lamps flicker, and the promenade is busy with cars and those strolling in their after-dinner. Uncle Dickie Hudnut is overcome with regret. Why did he allow this seance master to say such things? Why had he not intervened to silence him? The following morning, Natasha stood in the foyer with 2 cablegrams ready to be dispatched. One to George Ullman, asking for more updates on Rudy's condition, and another to Rudy expressing her deepest love for him. This cablegram was composed as the reversal of her last letter mailed somewhere crossing the prairie a year earlier. She wrote this cablegram as a long message of loving remorse in which she regretted their divorce and begged Rudy's every forgiveness. She assured him she would see him in New York within the next few weeks, and that she would care for him throughout his recovery. The agonizing wait for Rudy's reply then set in. When no cablegrams were delivered to the chateau on Sunday or on Monday, Natasha chain-smoked and paced in her bedroom. George stayed close, attempting to distract her with tales of the dogs and the monkeys' antics. Monday evening, George noticed Natasha seemed to be giving way to the long wait. She took to bed and called George to her room to ask him if the smell of tuberoses signified a death. Yes, Natasha, I think that is the case, but why do you ask? While I was setting my room just now to go to bed, I smelled them. The tuberose is so strong here in the room. It seemed to overpower me, and I felt dizzy. George sat down on the edge of the bed and leaned over to hold her in his arms as she wept, saying, I'm so frightened. On Tuesday morning, the cablegram arrived from New York, telling of Rudy's death the previous day. Uncle Dickie delivered the news. On hearing the crushing finality of that cablegram, Natasha rushed to collapse in her mother's arms, screaming, "No, no, no." Muzzy led her keening daughter to her bed, knowing any consolation to be futile. Natasha curled into her bed covers and through sobs called out to Rudy. She was confined to bed for days, with few attempts made to assuage her weeping. Muzzy and Aunt Teresa listened to her lamentations as she regretted everything. She relived every argument she and Rudy ever had, rued her words, analyzing every possible thing she did wrong. Her agony consumed her, and the chateau's halls echoed with the sounds of her sorrow. George reminded Natasha of Rudy's love, expressed in his final cablegram, saying surely their love was as true and strong as it ever was before he died. Day by day, Natasha was consoled with love and advice. She should not torture herself with regrets, for Rudy would not want her to be incapacitated with guilt and grief. During the last week of his earth life, Natasha and Rudy reconciled, experiencing their love renewed. Despite Natasha drifted at best during those first weeks after Rudy's death, eating little, smoking a great deal, George worried as he watched her sinking into her loss and would later recall, quote, "Natasha was prostrated by the news. Those who fancy this much misunderstood child to be cold and indifferent should have seen her as I saw her then. Her genuine grief proved her great love for Rudy, and her remorse at their misunderstandings and mistakes was heartbreaking to see. I am convinced from my closeness to the true facts surrounding these romantic figures, and regardless of what others might say, that Rudy was and ever will be the one real love of Natasha Rambova's earth life. I was happy that these two children of the limelight had been reconciled by their exchange of cables before death had stepped in. It made the final separation easier, and Rudy made the great change with Natasha's cable under his pillow." Chapter 9. Rudolphvalentino on team. The Hudnut Chateau, Juanlespin, early September 1926. Quote, "One evening, soon after Rudy's last rites had been performed in Hollywood, we were all sitting on the round glass veranda overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, watching a glorious sunset, when HPB suddenly appeared to me and said, 'Tell Natasha to write the story of her life with Rudy, and as an additional part to it, Rudy will contribute his revelations. Tell her to begin at once and not delay, as it will be a work which will accomplish much good.'" End quote. George would not easily convince Natasha to write a book about her life with Rudy, because she felt it far too soon. Yet it would not be long before Natasha changed her mind, and it was then the seances with Rudy began. According to George, Rudy began to speak through him, delivering messages meant for Natasha to share with the world. With Muzzy seeing her daughter's interest in the project piqued, she began organizing the seances and hired a court stenographer to record Rudy's words. As summer turned to fall, the chateau assumed an air of industriousness, with Natasha's writing being the focus of her days. Transcripts were typed, carbon copies filed, and the business of Natasha's narrative kept her occupied. During her day, she reclined on the terrace in a chaise lounge with her dogs on her lap to dictate the story of her life with Rudy to the stenographer. Muzzy would often prompt her with questions and had her own contributions. At night, seances were held with a stenographer present to record Rudy speaking through George. He related details of the process of his death, the constructs of heaven, mentioning deceased people he met and explaining his aspirations to succeed in his transition. Natasha was mesmerized by the accounts and anticipated the seance as if she were to spend time with her lost lover. While George was delivering Rudy's first revelations, the world reacted to his sudden death by pursuing Natasha for interviews and commentary. She refused to grant reporters audience when they arrived in droves to the chateau, and for a while the task of fielding their questions fell to Uncle Dickie. Although he was initially an atheist and a skeptic concerning all things psychic, by the end of the summer of 1926, his conversion was complete, and he became the president of the Légion des Services Spirituels in France. He openly professed his belief in George's abilities and acknowledged life after death as a reality, admitting he had witnessed evidence of this himself during many seances. When a letter arrived from George Allman in New York relaying news of Rudy calling out the name Jenny on the way to the hospital, Uncle Dickie calculated the timing in the seance at the chateau when George called out Jenny. He discovered it would have been the exact time Rudy was being transported to the hospital. Despite Uncle Dickie's conviction of the legitimacy of spiritualism, the tranquility of his restful chateau in Juanlespin was disrupted during the weeks following Rudy's death. With stenographers and typists racing about, reporters coming and going, Uncle Dickie Hudnut took control. He announced the summer over and suggested it was time for all to return to Manhattan, where they could complete their work and leave him to his peace. With little argument, Natasha and George packed up the dogs and the monkey and boarded the train to Paris, then on to Cherbourg, where they left for New York aboard the Homeric. Seances with Rudy would be held in Paris and in Natasha's stateroom on the crossing. By the time the ship neared New York Harbor, Natasha made her decision to co-author her book with Rudy. By including his seance messages, she titled Revelations. The Homeric docked in New York 2 months after Rudolphvalentino's death, and Natasha and George's arrival prompted a group of reporters to rush them at the end of the gangplank. Natasha handed them a story by telling them she had just completed writing a book on her life as Rudolphvalentino's wife. Then, to their amazement, she announced plans to include a section in the book she would title Revelations, which were 11 direct transmissions from Rudy in the afterlife, as revealed to her during seances. One reporter called out, "Are you saying, Natasha, that Rudy spoke to you from the dead?" "Yes, I am," she replied. When one reporter asked her if Rudy had any messages for his girlfriend Paula Negri, Natasha rebuked the reporter, saying, "Of course not. He spoke only of significant things and subjects that meant something." She then turned the questions over to George, who explained to the scribbling reporters how most of the seances were held in France, with some aboard the Homeric, where Valentino told of wondrous displays in heaven, including the celebrities he met. He also related how Rudy reported he attempted to communicate with his friends as they walked past his bier while he rested in repose in Campbell's funeral church. The following day, Natasha and George were pressed for more information, and they each granted interviews in their respective apartments. George fielding questions in his home at 614 West 152nd Street, and Natasha entertaining press in her luxurious living room. Quote, "The former Mrs. Valentino sought to explain revelations of the astral activities of the dead movie idol. None who watched her as she talked in her apartment could doubt her sincerity. She sat as impassive and oriental-looking as the picture of the Chinese mandarin in cloak of gold above her red-lacquered fireplace. Her long, slim fingers met in a pyramid clasped above her heart. She exclaimed, 'I do not say these things for publicity. I am not using my husband's name for profit. I am his spokesman, giving out what he has told me in spirit seances. Rudy still loves me, otherwise he would not send me messages. I am happy, and so is he. I am collecting his messages and will publish them. He was always very psychic. We had our quarrels. It doesn't matter. What matters most to me now is the effect the uncertainty Rudy's death caused among mortals. He is still in the first of the 7 astral planes, and has told me he often longed to take me with him to places, but he's too new yet. He knows how I love colors, and he always has loved the things I love, colors, music, art, beauty, and he speaks of the colors of that world where he now lives in the fullness of his young manhood. He will be forever young in that world. Ours is but a poor duplicate of it." While Natasha's news of Rudolphvalentino's revelations rolled off the presses, she spent one chilly November afternoon making final edits on her book while reclined on one of her black velvet sofas. George stands before the great terrace doors as Natasha sorts a few sheets of the manuscript. "Here, George, this is the end of it." She hands him the papers. "Can you read it aloud for me?" George takes the pages. "Yes, of course. This is how you want to end the book?" "Yes, my last word on the subject." George gives the papers a quick shuffle. Natasha nods. "Read." George clears his throat and begins his read of the end of Natasha's book. Quote, "Both Rudy and I were dreamers and too artistically ambitious. He was as great a worshipper at the shrine of beauty as I was. We both took for our model Douglas Fairbanks, whose great business ability and commercial fearlessness forms a combination difficult to equal. No, my fault was not selfish ambition, but it was conceit. I was conceited enough to imagine that I could force the producers into giving Rudy the kind of production which our artistic ambitions called for. Production such as Robin Hood, The Thief of Baghdad, or The Black Pirate. I could not understand why, with his ability, romance, magnetism, and proven drawing power, Rudy should not have the best. Why should he continually be thrust into small, trifling, cheap commercial pictures, while other artists of much less ability and popularity were given big stories and big productions? The injustice of it made me furious, and I stubbornly made up my mind that he should not be so used. Why should Rudy always be a pawn in the hand of the great iron-fisted, soulless god of commercialism? But that same great god only laughed at my puny efforts and clenched his iron fist all the tighter. It was my passionate love of history and beauty which caused all the trouble, as do all things carried to unreasonable extremes. In my intense desire to incorporate beauty into Rudy's productions, I lost my perspective. I lost sight of the fact that if beauty is only used as a shallow satisfaction for the eye, and not combined with food for the soul as well, it is but an empty, gilded shell. This I have learned. The public will accept a soul-inspiring or touching story which has no outward beauty, but they will not alone accept beauty which has no soul. The molehill of petty hen-pecking jibes soon grew to proportions of formidable mountain, helped, you may depend upon it, by our many friends who lost no opportunity in showing Rudy any articles of the above description. It was also extremely disagreeable for Rudy to be continually pitied for having a wife who would sacrifice his career for her own selfish ambitions. Another sore point, it seemed, was the fact that we did not go out often in the evenings or attend the usual Hollywood functions. This was accordingly taken as another proof of my managing. I was jealous, of course, and afraid to allow Rudy to be out with other women. Rudy's friends insisted that he must reinstate himself in the eyes of Hollywood, and I was the cause of his being wrongly labeled upstage. He must show Hollywood and the world that he was a regular fellow. Gloria Swanson was no fool when she packed her belongings and moved to New York, establishing her permanent home in the East, where there are at least plays, operas, concerts, and museums as diversions from the continual grind. We started to go out oftener. We did the expected thing. We joined in the fun. We danced, we gossiped, we giggled, we flirted, we laughed, we drank, and succeeded in being exceedingly bored. We even went on those amusing expeditions to Venice, the Coney Island of Hollywood, where we ate hot dogs, rode on the merry-go-round, and pretended we were having a hilarious time. Hollywood, with all the joys of the petty community life of Main Street, with an additional coating of gold dust thrown in for good measure. I'm not going to describe any of the widely heralded Hollywood parties with unmentionable details, nor am I insinuating that Hollywood is a wicked city, as it is not even that. It is merely an imitation-gilded hell of make-believe realm, nothing but sham, and more sham. Hollywood, and speaking of Hollywood, I'm referring only to the picture colony, is one continuous struggle of nobodies trying to become somebodies, all pretending to be what they are not. It has been said that this earth life is the schoolroom in which we learn our lessons. In Hollywood, like many others, I was given a test, and like many others, I failed in it. We are also told that we learn our lessons by bitter experience. I think the next time I shall pass the test. Rudy is more fortunate. He has already passed onto a higher grade." End quote. George turns to Natasha. "So this is your ending?" "Yes, of my narrative, George," Natasha adds. "But this is followed by Rudy's words, his revelations." "Then it shall be. The book is done." George hands the papers back to Natasha. "Yes, now Rudy speaks." George nods as his eye catches a glimpse of frost crackling on one of the terrace door's panes of glass. A small, perfectly formed dragon is taking shape in the rime. "George," Natasha asks. "Yes, what is it? Can you close the drapery?" George gathers the vermilion velvet, saying, "Then the book ends with Rudy's revelations. Wonderful, Natasha. Just brilliant."